Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Hello, and welcome to the Dunlop Art Gallery Artist Talk called End of the World, Beginning of the World with Andrea Carlson, who is featured in the current exhibition at Dunlop Art Gallery. My name is Wendy Peart, and I'm one of the curators for this exhibition, States of Collapse, that is currently on exhibition at Dunlop Art Gallery Central and Sherwood Gallery until April 9th. This exhibition explores the human preoccupation with the end of the world scenarios and the experiences of those who have lived through various forms of extreme change or cultural collapse due to various human-made conditions. Not so ironically, we are currently living through one of such conditions with the current COVID-19 pandemic. Dunlop Art Gallery is located on Treaty 4 territory, the lands of the Nehiwa, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. I thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose footsteps have marked this territory. I am a descendant of settler people, and within my professional and personal work, I recognize how interconnected we all are by respecting the land and learning about and honoring Indigenous cultures and traditional territories. Today our guest is Andrea Carlson, who Dunlop has previously featured in the 2015 exhibition called Material Girls, which toured nationally. Andrea Carlson is an Ojibwe visual artist and writer currently living on Potawatomi land in Chicago, Illinois. Carlson's layered practice includes painting, drawing, and arts writing on subjects ranging from museum studies, Indigenous futurisms, and assimilation, metaphors, and film. Her art is in the collections of the British Museum, the Minneapolis Institute of Art, the Walker Center, and the National Gallery of Canada. Carlson received awards from McKnight Foundation in 2008, Joan Mitchell Foundation in 2016, and 3 Arts Make a Wave in 2020. I want to note that at the end of her talk, Andrea may answer your questions. Please type any questions that you might have in the chat or comment field, and we will refer to them at the end of her talk. Also note that at times there might be technical difficulties, but please stay on the line as these should be resolved quickly. So I'm just going to hand things over to Andrea right now, and we'll chat again later.
Well, hello. Bonjour, Nindanoe, Maganidok, Kagayasagek, Nindijanakaz, Gitche o Nigaming, Nindish Gonagun, Nikanak, Nindo Dame, Chicago, Nindunjaba, Nungum, Potawatomi King, Miigwech, Bizendawiek. So that was my Ojibwe speech protocol. I'm Ojibwe, Grand Portage Ojibwe. And if we could go to the slides, maybe the second slide. I'm just going to get right into some visual, something for you to look at other than me. The second slide, please. So I wanted to show you, because I just introduced myself in Anishinaabe Moen, where I'm from, where my family is from, and where I am enrolled. This is Grand Portage, Minnesota. It's if you imagine the state of Minnesota, if you know the shape, the very kind of top tip of Minnesota that's on Lake Superior is Grand Portage. It's against Canada and kind of butts up against Fort William on the Canadian side. The people of this area, the stories that come from this area are created between the shore and these bluffs, these mountains and hills that are behind us. I kind of think of the shore as a very storied place, a place where if you walk on the beach and you hear your footfalls and you hear the sounds of the waves and your heart beating, that stories get pulled out of these repetitive patterns that puts us in these meditative, creative places to think about new new places, new stories, or let your mind wander into places that maybe it wouldn't have. On the lower right is my grandmother with my older sister sitting on the beach near Grand Portage. But this is the when I think of where my work sits, I think of home. I think of this infinite horizon line that is Lake Superior. We can't see across it from that place. This is also the home of, if you're art history buff, George Morrison was Grand Portage Ojibwe. He's no longer with us. He died in 2000, but he's, American modernist, abstract expressionist, some people call him. But if you know his work, he has these lines that intersect his work, this infinite horizon line, and that's because of kind of having Grand Portage and Lake Superior. If you live in northern Minnesota, if you live on Lake Superior, that has moods, that it's alive. You kind of start organizing information around this infinite line. Next slide, please. So right after grad school, I had been doing grad school and undergrad when I was learning the language and learning the traditional Atsakana, the traditional stories. I did a number of paintings based on the traditional stories. One of the ways that our stories are frozen, because they're performed, they're acted out. We breathe life into them when we perform them. One of the storytelling devices that we have is Benewajit. There's you're telling a story, and right at the very pinnacle of this, right at the part in the story that's the most suspenseful, the storyteller will say, Benewajit, the rough grouse's asshole. And that is a cue to the listener and to everyone that the story is now frozen until the next night where it can carry on, because some of the stories can go on and on and on. Some stories just bleed into the next story. So I was trying to think of ways where you'd take a story out of performance and freeze it. And so I decided to use the Benewajit, the rough grouse's asshole, as a way of taking a performance and making it a static image. So behind this urn in this piece, you can kind of see the tail feathers. You can kind of see a round anus, and you can kind of see the bird's face and wings kind of peeking out behind this urn. You can also see Nana Buju's buttocks. I'm trying to be polite, but I'm using the wrong words. Superimposed on this image that is playing out in the background, this landscape, is this urn. This is my first exhibition outside of grad school, and it was at a museum. So I was starting to think about museums as their own landscapes, as their own kind of false landscapes, where they take things in from the world and they showcase them, but they're a landscape of white boxes, and that's not that's definitely a fantasy scape. So I was taking the objects out of the museum and putting them into my imagined landscapes. Next slide. This piece is really important to I would say, as far as location-wise, to Minnesota. It's again, this is another object from the Minneapolis Institute of Art's permanent collection, and it's a plate that was manufactured in Hamburg, Germany, for export to the United States, and it was made in 1862. And if you're a history buff, or if you know Native history, which is just history, the plate features Fort Snelling, which was a concentration camp for the Dakota people in Minnesota. If you know about the Dakota, and Google all these things if you don't know these things, but if you know about the Dakota 38+2, Abraham Lincoln signed an order in 1862, the day after Christmas, that 38 Dakota men were simultaneously hung after the Dakota Uprising. And there was over 2,000 settler spectators that came to watch this simultaneous hanging. They built a square platform and that dropped out from underneath the men. So when I see a plate that features Fort Snelling, and when people in Minnesota who know these histories see this plate, they don't see, they might see some of the nationalism, but if you know the story of Fort Snelling and you know the story of the Dakota War of 1862, you wonder what on earth you would be eating off of this plate, what on earth you would be expected to eat off of this plate. So I put this in a more violent landscape within this piece. It's something that seems harmless, can have so much more significance. We heap stories onto objects, and my paintings are objects too. Next slide. So at this point, my early works with the Atakanag and then with some of the museum object pieces, I'm starting to move into thinking about objects writ large, not necessarily just museum objects and things that are collected. But in this piece, I have a microphone and a light gauge, and I was thinking more in terms of like things that are tools that are used for archiving and collecting other collections in other forms. I'm also starting to think about films and movies and films that depict violence, and especially I move into cannibal genre films. On the left, the landscape in the left is from Cliff House in San Francisco, and on the right it's Grand Portage, or it's Grand Marais, which is very close to Grand Portage, the shoreline where my grandma currently lives. So I'm thinking about landscape as like, this is almost a folded landscape. You can have an interior shore from the interior of the continent, and then you can have, a shore that's a major port for North America, and just how water is all connected, how everything merges, how we actually physically live on a singular landscape. Next slide. I wish this slide was a bit bigger. At this point in my career, these pieces are, I'm going to use inches, but they're 44 by 60 inches. This is part of my VOR series, where I'm commenting more on the consumed and the consumer. This piece is called Cannibal Holocaust. I think I did it in 2007 or 2008, and it's mixed media on paper. I was starting to consider storytelling in terms of the Anishinaabe character for the Wendigo, who is a winter cannibal monster who misidentifies who he consumes. But I'm thinking about the commodification of difference, how museums misidentify who they consume, and who tells the story, and talking about it metaphorically in terms of cannibalism, or the idea of cannibalism. Next slide. This one's more overtly that way. This piece is called Cannibal Ferox, and on the right, there's much more of a propaganda piece towards Indigenous people. We were, historically accused of being cannibals, because if you consume another human being, it's, an incredible taboo. But also Indigenous people all over the world were accused of eating their fellow man. At the same time, Christians were trying to convert Indigenous people to Christianity and requiring Indigenous people to eat gods, eat the body of Christ. And so that kind of sets up this dichotomy, or false dichotomy, this colonial narrative of Native people being terrestrial, that we look to the earth for our philosophies, and whereas European people and Christians look to the heavens, look to gods, they're eating their god, and Natives are eating man, like looking in different directions. Clearly, that's false, and it's part of the libel that was put against Indigenous people in order to justify some of the cruelty that has happened against Indigenous people historically. So I was mashing up some of these concepts and some of the misidentification of people. On the left, it looks like it's a boy biting a severed arm, but it's actually a sculpture. I think it's in the British Museum. It's a two-part sculpture, and one part of it went missing, but it's two boys wrestling, and where the two stone pieces fit together was at the arm. And then when the other part of the sculpture went missing, they started referring to this piece as Cannibal Boy, even though that's not what he's doing. But one of the things I'm also drawn to is these stories of misidentification. Next slide. So as I was talking earlier about like the folded landscape, how a place like Grand Portage and Cliff House could be connected, this is how these four pieces could be fit together. This is actually installed at the plug-in ICA in Winnipeg, for those of you that have been there. So you can kind of see slightly above the center line that the infinite landscape, the infinite horizon line or waterscape could go on and on, but it connects from piece to piece, and they kind of work like in a modular way where any piece could go next to each other and they would continue this horizon line. That is, when I think of things like seascapes or landscapes, we pluralize it, it's landscapes, but topologically speaking, we live on a sphere. And so we kind of live on this unified landscape, singular, and it's infinite because like a sphere, at least a two-dimensional thing could go around a sphere endlessly. And it's a really interesting way of thinking about landscape. To me, I think it's very interesting to think about the land as being infinite. And so it's something that I'm addressing kind of topologically speaking through this work, even though it's, a single view. Next slide. This piece is Cut and Run. It's another Vor piece. Again, there's elements of things that animals that eat other animals. This piece is in the collection, the National Gallery of Canada. Next slide. So about 2016, the beginning of Trump's presidency, actually maybe several months before that, but at the beginning of 2016, I moved from Minneapolis to Chicago. And that move, I did a lot of road trips back and forth on I-94, which is the interstate that connects between Minneapolis and Chicago. It goes through Wisconsin. And I was learning while I was moving my stuff back and forth, while I have commitments back in Minneapolis. And I was learning that Wisconsin is the home of many, many effigy mounds. Mounds that are in the shape of birds and lizards and people, and just these incredible, beautiful mounds. So many of the mounds were destroyed with the settler plow, but many still remain all over the University of Wisconsin-Madison's campus. They have mounds that sometimes in the spring the snow will melt off they're very shallow mounds, but the snow will melt off of the mounds first, and you can see the outline of turtles and birds, cranes and lizards. So it's a term that I don't like using, but the Mississippian cultures, the mound builders, the Hopewell people through Ohio and in Illinois, maybe those terms are kind of used to compartmentalize or bubble the ancestors, and sometimes people see it as not serving contemporary Native people because it denies us continuity. But these particular images are cut mica sheets in the shape of hands and talons. There's also there's some other forms like wings and birds, and I became very drawn to those of us that have our ancestors that have made mounds. Next slide. So this piece I did shortly after moving to Chicago and learning more about mounds and learning more about these various. Then at the two sides of this piece, there's those bent trail markers, and then at the top it's exit. This piece is called exit. This isn't a painting; it's a 20 layer screen print. It was produced by High Point Center for Printmaking in Minneapolis. But yeah, it was a substantial amount of work on behalf of High Point Center for Printmaking, and I couldn't have done this without them. But you can see at the center that there are those mica talon forms. And then if you look at the very center of this piece, there's this silver kind of shape. It's inverted, but just kind of remember that shape because the next slide, you can go to the next slide, Sarah. It's an image of Mound Man. So this guy is in Baraboo, Wisconsin. He has a split head, and if you know the petroglyphs and above the north of the Great Lakes and around the Great Lakes area, you'll see this kind of split head come up a lot. So a road intersects his legs, and the city painted his legs back on and into a cow pasture at his feet. And they sometimes put a chalk outline around him so you can see it because he's very shallow. But I think that this is I really enjoy this mound. I went and visited him several times when I was moving. Next slide, please. This is the second print I did with High Point Center for Printmaking. It's called Anti-Retro. And it has at the center a horse that is perpetually falling. It's just suspended because it's in print form, and so he can always live on the edge of death. And then there's cowboys on the wings, fighting and wrestling and struggling. There are two trees on either side, similar to the bent trail marker trees. And I'll talk about the one on the left. It looks kind of like twisted. It's what settlers referred to as the witch tree. But it's the Little Spirit cedar tree that's in Grand Portage, Minnesota, in my nation. So when Grand Portage was a big fort, a fur trading fort, when the fur traders would come in, there's this rock off of Hat Point that the fur traders knew they were getting close to Grand Portage's harbor when they saw Little Spirit cedar tree. And the next slide, please. And here's what it looks like. No one can just go to Grand Portage and visit it. You have to be with an enrolled member of Grand Portage to go visit it. The fear is the entrance to the trail has been kind of obscured. The fear is that people will hear the term witch tree and they'll go out to it and they'll cut it down because of fear of, I don't know, witches. I don't really know, but it's vulnerable. It's outside, just like the mounds from the previous slides are things that there's a lot of places that remain outside and vulnerable. And the Little Spirit cedar tree is one of them. They don't really know how old it is. It's over 300 years old. And it's just growing right out of this rock off of Hat Point. And I've been out there several times and grew up with it. Some people say it's kind of twisted. You can find images of it online. And some people say it looks like a woman's body because it's kind of curvy, I guess. Next slide. I would be amiss to not talk about Hyde Erdrick. That's Louise Erdrick's sister, if you are familiar with her novels. Hyde and I are really great friends. She's a poet, and she's Turtle Mountain Ojibwe, and she also really loves Grand Portage. So she writes poetry about Grand Portage, and this, we also share this kind of, when we research things, we always just seem to be not intentionally researching the same subjects. So there's this lighthouse outside of Grand Portage that has this Fresnel lens in it, and I heard the story that my ancestors in Grand Portage, when the lighthouse first went in, thought that the Fresnel lens looked like a Wendigo eye, is what they called it, and I became kind of fascinated with that story, that there was this light that was going around at night, and that the lens was being referred to as a Wendigo eye. So I started putting that in my artwork, and I've done a few of Hyde's book covers, and you can kind of see out in the upper left. And so she's written about this image, non-image, of how Fresnel lenses work and how that also relates to my art. Next slide. They can kind of see it looks like a spaceship because it's kind of coming down from the top. There's the Fresnel lens. There's the golden records from the Voyager's spacecraft. And then if you go to the next slide, and there's a snake, of course. So that one slide that you had just seen is actually part of 60, one of a suit of 60. These are about 11 inches high by 30 inches each, and then it makes this grid. This also has shown at the Plugin Institute for Contemporary Art. So it's really hard to tell in this, so I'll just kind of explain some of the ideas behind it. It's called Ink Babble. It was painted in, it's mostly ink and oil and paper segments, and it was painted in 2014. Hyde says that I didn't think about this when I made it. I was trying to do, and I'll show you on the next slide, but it kind of looks like a wake pattern. It kind of looks like a Fresnel lens with the image, non-image, with the this kind of wovenness of imagery. It's 10 stacked landscapes and has several towers. I was thinking of towers as these points of power on a map where you can either see long distances. There's fire watch towers, and there's communication, cell phone towers, different towers built into this piece, imagery wise. Next slide. So one of my, someone that was, one of my friends that was interviewing me put together this slide for me to kind of explain it, because it's just, hang with me for a second, because it's kind of tricky to explain. If you were to take some celluloid film out of a movie camera, just a strip of it, and you had shot a panorama of a landscape and had various objects or elements or characters, if you were to look at that strip of film, each character or each object on that panorama would kind of candy cane. It would, be iterative, but it would, there would be several slides, and each time the person or the object would reappear. And then once played all together, it looks like a pan shot, but it's, a number of still images. So that would be a panorama, but it would be time dominant, because you'd be looking at the differences between each take. And then I was thinking about that, about a film strip panorama with this, with a way of looking at time. And then if you could take that and pull it in the second direction, that had space dominant panoramas. So each column is time dominant, and each row is space dominant. So space dominant would be more like still photography, like just regular photograph panorama, where it's just the length of the panorama doesn't convey time. it's just one static image. So I consider Ink Babble kind of a bifurcated double panorama with how the landscape is stacked, and how in each column it would be a single, that the landscape would be a single landscape just stacked up. But in every row, that's just 10 different landscapes, or 10 stacked space dominant landscapes. So it's a way of thinking of time and space and dimensionality through the organizing of a two-dimensional painting. Next slide. When I was working on Ink Babble, I thought about what it would mean to, if I was to do a sister piece to that piece, but in full color. But since that Ink Babble took me well over a year, I kind of forgot how to use color. So I painted this as only 4 stacked landscapes, and it's 6 wide. It's still substantially large. But I was playing with bringing in color and bringing in some of just this kind of like folded out stacked earths or recreation of the world. Next slide. This is the piece that I'm going to walk you through on how it was made and some of the reference images in this piece. This is Red Exit. The original just sold to the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, and there is a replica of this piece. It was documented, photographed, and then made into a billboard that is currently on display outside of the Whitney, off of the High Line. If you've ever been to the Whitney, the new Whitney with the where the High Line, which is this rail line that was turned into a pedestrian park, and then it terminates, and then right across the street, this billboard is there. So at the center, there's a loon with kind of Métis patterns coming off of it. It's a piece, I would think, like if it had an elevator pitch, that Red Exit is about recreating the world. It is about healing and health and getting through something terrible and getting onto the other side of it. And it's about survival. And so Anishinaabe people have this story about earth divers, and a lot of Algonquin people do. It's not just Ojibwe or Anishinaabe people, but so various animals dove down to retrieve a little bit of dirt in order to recreate the world. The loon tries and fails, and several animals try and fail, and the muskrat ends up succeeding in our version. And so there are muskrats in this piece. There's a loon at its center. There's an infinity sign, again, a nod to Métis people. The Anishinaabe author Gerald Bisner writes about earth divers in terms of Métis people and survival. So I was kind of going off of his cue with that. This piece also has the mound man in the upper right. He's actually coming up off of the land and walking away. This piece has lots of various little bits and pieces that might be recognized. Next slide, please. This is scale for both Ink Babble and Red Exit. They've never actually been together. Put these 2 images together just to show what they could potentially look like together. And then for scale. But they're inverses of each other. The black and white Ink Babble is much more dystopic, and then Red Exit is much more about recreating the world. Next slide. So this is a muskrat swimming in the water. The little ripples off. Hyde was right. It definitely, these 2 pieces both look like it's a wake pattern. Next slide. Also, another thing that is both in Red Exit, but something that I think, kind of also has that, these assumption, the Métis, these patterns that are in the Métis sashes. Also, to me, they look like ripples on water. Next slide. So beautiful. Here's 2 detail shots of Red Exit. On the left is from Petroglyph, again with the split head man. And if you look, I didn't get a really great image of what's in his this detail, but what's in his little thought bubble. I'll just kind of look at it. You can see a otter at the bottom, but I'll explain what it is that's coming out of his voice bubble. And then on the right, there's the word Ikwe, woman, and Ojibwe. And then you can kind of see a little bit of a red semicircle. I'll explain what that is on the next slide. So Ikwe was a movie that you can find online to watch, but it was done primarily in Ojibwe language. I'll tell you about it in a minute. And then on the left, there's a medallion. If anyone knows the curator, Nancy Marie Mythlow, she does an Indigenous pavilion at the Venice Biennale every other year. And a few years back, the artist that she was working with commissioned another artist to make this beaded medallion. The Venice Biennale does a Golden Lion Award, and I don't know that it's ever been given to a Native person. But what these artists did by commissioning this was they gave themselves the agency and control to give the Golden Lion to whoever they wanted. And they gave it to they gave this medallion to their collaborator in Italy. But it was a way of, they created the agency, they created the award for themselves that they could give away. I absolutely love that. I love that claiming the ability to recognize the accomplishments and the work of others, not waiting for institutions to recognize Native people in particular. But I also, when I think of locating my own desire, I would rather have that medallion than anything that came from the Venice Biennale. I think that when I locate my own desire, and this is something that's changed over the course of my career, I used to want to take the front door into institutions and not some side door that was invented or made for Native people. I used to want to have what all of the modernist white men had. And I think that over the course of my career, I've started desiring spaces and opportunities and recognition from other Native people. I still think that it's an important thing to consider when Native, like if I can only show in Native art shows, or if I can only show with other Native women. But I do think that it's really important, especially the spaces that Natives have for ourselves, or the support that we give each other is so important. And so the film, Ikwe, the film, if you haven't seen it, it's, a fur trader marries a Native woman, and I'm going to undersell it. I'm not going to do a great job because it's been years since I've seen it, but I'll just tell you about the ending. And if you don't want to, if you don't want to hear the end of this film, just close your ears until the next slide. But so Ikwe ends with everyone getting smallpox and dying. The whole entire community is wiped out, and it ends with this little girl who looks like she might be around 5 years old, walking. She survives, and she's all alone. She's walking the shoreline, and you don't know her story. You don't know where it's just the most apocalyptic. It's the most terrifying ending that you could imagine on a film. And there's no resolution to it. She's just, everyone has been killed, and she's alone trying to just walking to get out of that situation and try to, find some way to survive. Anyway, it's just such a bleak image that it ends with. But the film was done primarily in Ojibwe language. So as a language learner, it's something that that a lot of Ojibwe scholars will go to because there's not a terrible amount of media that is in our languages. Next slide. So before, when I was telling you about the split-headed man from the petroglyphs, this is what was in his voice bubble. It's actually a drawing that was made in protest of the Treaty of Lapont. The Treaty of Lapont is what stole Grand Portage, or Grand Portage didn't have any representatives at that signing of that treaty, and it is what ended up sacrificing all of our land to it, or ceding all of our land, or a fair amount of it through this treaty that we had no signers on. Years later, they had to redo the treaty in order to include Grand Portage, and this image is the resistance to the re-signing of it. And then it has the various clans all in accordance. Their hearts are all connected and their minds are all connected, and it's relating to the land, Pigeon River, and then the crane. The thought that goes out of his is that they thought that there was an agreement that has been severed. So it's a really interesting. I feel like this image, I'm not doing it justice right now, but I feel like it's a very interesting image as a resistance to unfair treaty making. Next slide. I'm just going to show a couple images while I was in process with Red Exit. You can see more the mound man getting up to leave. On his face it says "One fed all," referring to the earth. Next slide. You can see my cannibalizing of my own prior work of the talons, the mica hand forms. And this isn't finished yet. This is in an early stage. Next slide. So in a number of works, I put the underside of a turtle. Some of my work looks like it's split open. So there's a lot of symmetry and mirroring that goes on in my work. I'm Turtle Clan, Mikanak, not Mashike. So I'm more of the snapping. I'm not the beautiful painted. But I love painted turtles, mud turtles. They have these beautiful paintings on their chest that they keep between themselves and the earth, and they create that very intimate space between their chests and the earth, and that this is what they are carrying around, like this very intimate painting. And when it's exposed, they're more or less in trouble or flipped over. But I put the underside of turtles in a few of my pieces. Next slide. And you can kind of see them in this one, but this is me trying to make a giant painting from my living room floor during the pandemic. This whole entire piece, it was started about over a year ago, before the pandemic was officially announced. And I was in New Orleans at an artist residency at the Joan Mitchell Center, and they sent all the artists home early because of the pandemic, so I had to finish on my living room floor. And it was interesting because I had already, pieced together mostly that this was a piece about the recreation of the world, and then it seemed like the world fell apart while I was working on it. And I had already done a dystopic piece, and this was supposed to be the healing piece, and then I end up doing it from my house. Next slide. And that's only half of it. This is the other half. So I could only work half at a time or lay them out in only three columns at a time. So next slide, please. And this is it on the billboard right now, finished and ready for people to see it in a socially distanced way. Sorry, this slide's kind of crappy, but that's it.
That was really great. Thank you so much for giving us a really in-depth look at your process and all your reference points. We don't have any questions from our chat, but again, it's because I think you were very detailed in your explanation. But I have to say that, I mean, the first time I saw your work was at Plugin ICA. I think it was probably in 2014 or 2015 or something like that. And what struck me immediately was this epicness of your work. And just the overall, it seemed to encompass so much. It's like, to me, it's like looking at a grain of sand on the beach and finding all the wonder in that one little nugget that you knew repeated and echoed throughout, even though I didn't know yet all the meaning behind all the imagery. And so I find it really compelling to see how you are weaving your Indigenous knowledge, philosophical systems, and things that you can legitimately share with broader audiences into the contemporary world. Again, bringing with that all the complexity that entails. It's just your work is very complex. And it would take a lifetime to pull it apart, I think. And I think your work echoes that whole kind of strategy.
Yeah, it's definitely, I feel like it's something that has to be seen in person to see all of the different material uses. Definitely for material girls, that there's a materiality to all of those various mediums. It's got oil and gouache and color pencil and ink, and number of, if I can get my hands on it, I typically put it in my work. Yeah. I find a way. I'm an archivist nightmare. The conservators, they're at least challenged by my work. But yeah, it's definitely something that needs to be seen in person, and I think that even when my work is made into things like billboards, it just it's something where I want an intimacy. I want people to be able to see it up close, and then walk back and be their own editors of the work, wonder it themselves. So.
Well, we've just had another question, we've had a number of comments, but here's a question for you. Hi, Andrea. Is there a reason you choose to work on paper versus other media?
Yeah, well, first of all, the paper that I use is 400-pound arches paper that has internal sizing, so it's really, if acidic materials get on it, it kind of neutralizes the acid. Arches, on every tablet of paper, it has 1492 on it, because I guess the company was founded then, ironically enough. It's terrible. That's not why I use it. I found that out recently, and but it's I like to be able to use mechanical pencils and color pencils, and if you ever use gouache, you can draw on. It's like painting with Pepto-Bismol. And you can put ink over the top of it, or you can put other materials stick to it. There's also when I was doing the screen prints, I had to relearn how to paint, because each layer I would have to paint individually. The 20 layers, each color is a different sheet of mylar that I would paint on with a black acrylic that would block out the light. And learning how to paint with acrylic on acetate was so hard because it was like such a smooth surface that my brush would skate across the top, and I was used to the resistance, the thirstiness of paper as it drew ink and various materials down into it. So yeah, it took me a while to figure out how to do the screen prints, but paper is just, it's so versatile. You can put nearly anything on it, and it's very forgiving. For me, it's very forgiving. But I started off oil on canvas and switched over to paper because of its just, and I'm also incredibly thrifty. So you can stack up, you can have a piece that's, 20 feet long by 10 feet, 15 feet high, and you can stack it up and ship it in a small box, and then let the installer, don't tell anyone at Plug-in ICA, but let the installer deal with installing it. But it's easy to store, and you can do really large pieces. And that's another reason, because I want to, and I would say that this is also true just being a woman in a museum or a Native person in a museum. Like, I kind of want to unapologetically take up a bunch of space. So I love making the big pieces because you can't miss it. It envelops you. It consumes you. And I also want to, make work where people, can get back, but they're drawn into those little tiny details that are made with like a mechanical pencil, but they're still there, so it's still satisfying when you get up really close. But I need to probably move on from paper, but that's
why, if it's working for you.
I do like a good challenge. I have people trying to get me to do sculpture now, and
well, those are your choices, I guess. I've just got a couple. There's one person who's submitted a comment, so I'm just going to show that. It's kind of a two-part one. Making a reference to your work and that of David Opdyke's work, who, for those of you who don't know, David Opdyke is also in this exhibition, States of Collapse. So I think, yeah. So, and then the other one after that it's very similar. It's from the same person.
Well, I think that's a really cool. I think that's a really cool observation. But yeah, I feel like, I'd say especially like doing landscapes as an Indigenous person, when you think of like the history of landscapes as well. I mean, when I went through school, in art history classes, they teach you about Flemish landscape painting and how that developed after the Spanish after the Dutch kicked the Spanish occupation out. Then Flemish landscapes just took off and were very, very popular. And it was, some of the psychology behind it was they fought for their land, and then they were like kind of retaining it in the form of landscapes, and were just so proud of, it's also very nationalistic, being proud of the land that they had fought for. And so, and they're also like owning a little piece of land in the form of a painting. Clearly that's different from Indigenous people and like the Americana painting, the Western, the kind of Western genre landscaping or landscape painting. It's colonial art form when it comes over to North America. It's really, so when I do landscape, that's where I'm kind of coming from, is like, land back. Land is very important to Indigenous people. And so my landscapes are inaccessible, like I don't think people can imagine themselves in it. They typically, I'll have, some kind of carnivore there, or I'll have something that's kind of blocking your way into the piece. So I think that I relate to landscape in a way that's very aware of the colonial gaze, and that is kind of resistant. Sometimes I think about how to make a decolonized landscape that you can't access because it's a painting. And can we ever really achieve decolonization, or is it just something we can move towards? without ever accomplishing? Is it just like anti-racism and anti-gender discrimination? Like, is it something that we can move towards? But what does it look like? Could we ever get there? So I feel like landscapes can also be that way too, as far as fantasies.
I appreciate that explanation of access to the landscape and how that fits in with your ideas. I agree here. Margaret has made a comment that I actually felt very strongly towards, was your metaphor with the turtle and the earth. So yeah, thanks, Margaret. Do you want to comment any more on that, Andrea?
Well, there's actually like one of the teachings that I remember hearing is that the calendar is on like a turtle's back. There's 13 plates on the top of a turtle. So it's not just the belly is the cool part for me, but the back of the turtle has these 13 plates on it, and that there's one for each moon, and that's we're lunar calendar people, and I think that's a really cool turtle teaching. Now whenever I see a turtle, I'm like, I just fascinated by both sides of him, but I try not to pester turtles too much. But
oh yeah, they're amazing creatures. That's all we have for the questions. And so at this point, I'm going to wrap up this wonderful time with you by thanking you for your generosity of time and spirit and sharing with us the kind of intimate layering of your work and how you create it and all the meanings behind that. And also to remind people that States of Collapse is going to be up until April 9th. And there's still time to come and see Andrea's work in person because that's what she likes the best. And I would agree.
Wear a mask.
Wear masks, and it'll all be safe. We have, hand sanitizer, and we have all the protocols in place to be completely safe there. Also, we just want to remind people that if you want further information on the exhibition itself and the artists, and there's recordings of this talk will be up there too, but we have a site called dunloplearning.ca where we have a lot of extra information about the exhibition and the artists. So please join us there. And for any upcoming events, we have lots, and you can find them on our Facebook site, our YouTube channel, and of course the Dunlop Art Gallery website. So please check it out. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Andrea, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Wendy. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.